They say a lie can travel around the world before the truth even gets its shoes on. And for those lies, Joe Rogan is like Red Bull. He gives them wings. At least, that's the way he's been for lies during the COVID pandemic. His show has been just a breeding ground of fake experts acting like they know what they're talking about, spreading blatant lies about COVID, the pandemic, and vaccines. Joe doesn't have the expertise to adequately question them or evaluate their claims, so he ends up believing them and just helping them spread more misinformation. Among the cast of characters who have spread COVID misinformation on Joe Rogan's podcast, Brett Weinstein is one of the most bizarre. He consistently makes claims about things that he knows nothing about, and these claims are so easily debunked, I'm surprised that Jamie doesn't Google them and debunk them right there on Joe Rogan's podcast. For some reason, that doesn't happen, so that's why I'm here. Hey, I'm Dr. Wilson. I'm a PhD molecular biologist, and welcome to another COVID debunking video. And obviously, today I'm talking about Brett Weinstein's most recent appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast. So, yeah, Brett said a lot of wrong things about COVID and COVID vaccines on this episode, and Joe did not correct that misinformation before it went out to his tens of millions of listeners. So let's just get into the first clip and start talking about why what Brett said is so wrong.
Egregious example of YouTube censoring a real expert who has said something that has been publicly declared. You would speak to this better than me. You're not supposed to vaccinate during a pandemic because it encourages variants, or it opens up the possibility of variants. Like, what is the reason for that?
You are essentially in a battle with a pathogen, and the pathogen is primed to be able to evolve. And so if you vaccinate ahead of a pandemic, then when the pathogen attempts to infect people, it runs into a lot of immune systems that see it coming. If you vaccinate into an active pandemic, you're doing a number of different things. For one thing, maybe the worst thing, is you're guaranteeing that the pathogen is going to encounter a lot of people who are in the process of developing immunity. So what you're giving them is like an environment that's set up to train them to escape the immunity that the vaccine produces.
Okay, so here he's talking about a guy named Gert Vanden Bosch's ideas. They watch a clip from one of his videos later in the podcast, but I've made several videos about Gert on this channel, and his ideas are just plain bananas. First of all, this idea that you don't vaccinate into a pandemic is just completely baseless. There is absolutely no historical or scientific or even theoretical precedence to support such an idea. In fact, doing exactly that is how we eradicated smallpox. Smallpox was eradicated thanks to a technique called ring vaccination, where once an outbreak happens, you immediately go in and vaccinate all of the contacts of those who were infected. This essentially prevents the virus from transmitting to new hosts, and thus ends its chain of transmission. And thus, smallpox was eradicated. It is also historically how we have vaccinated against things like yellow fever. Wherever there are outbreaks, you go and vaccinate that population to prevent more people from getting sick. Same story with polio or with measles. All of these diseases were essentially controlled by vaccinating the populations regardless of whether or not an outbreak was happening at that time. And with SARS-CoV-2 vaccination, we have seen that whether or not you vaccinate into an outbreak, you reduce hospitalizations and deaths in the population, which is the whole point. We know that all of this happens not only because we've observed it, but because we know that the immune system kicks in and starts to neutralize the virus faster than if you were unvaccinated. Ultimately, this means that you're reducing the amount that the virus can reproduce inside your body. Therefore, by vaccinating, you are putting more barriers in front of the virus to not only reduce hospitalizations and deaths, but also reduce its capacity to replicate and transmit. Thus, you reduce its ability to form new variants. And that's exactly what we see with COVID vaccines. There has been absolutely no evidence that vaccines increase the rate of variants. Gert will always present some word salady nonsense about increasing immune pressure and thus forcing the virus to evolve faster than it otherwise would. But This just doesn't make any sense. Number one, we have not actually seen this when it is directly tested for. For example, this paper tested whether or not SARS-CoV-2 has more within-host diversity in vaccinated versus unvaccinated individuals. And the answer is that SARS-CoV-2 genetic diversity is less diverse in vaccinated people, meaning it doesn't actually replicate or mutate as much. Again, because it doesn't have as much opportunity to do so when compared to an unvaccinated person. Number two is that this immune pressure that he is so worried about is going to be there whether or not you vaccinate, because the virus is going to rip through the population. And when that happens, people are going to acquire infection-induced immunity, and that is going to provide a selection pressure for the virus. The only difference when you don't vaccinate is that you get a lot more hospitalizations, a lot more death, a lot more illness, a lot more suffering. But apparently Gert is okay with that. And so is Brett. And Brett has convinced Joe to be on board with that too. So, congratulations, Brett. Gert's claims were wrong, they have always been wrong, and they will continue to be wrong because there is no data to support his claims.
They aren't vaccines. And I was convinced that that was not an important issue. Lots of people were upset by the redefinition of the term vaccine. I wasn't convinced it was an important issue.
This has been a popular one online lately. This idea that they changed the definition of vaccines because COVID vaccines are not actually vaccines. It's just stupid. The wording of the definition of vaccine actually changes quite frequently. If you use the Wayback Machine to look at the definition of vaccine and how that wording has changed, you can see just that. It changes a lot. But no matter how the wording of the definition of vaccine changes, it's always been the same thing. It is a prophylactic intervention to induce an immune memory response to protect against the disease caused by a particular pathogen. It doesn't matter what words you choose to communicate that, whether you say it induces immunity, whether you say it produces antibodies, whatever. It does the same thing. And that is all that's happened here. The wording has changed yet again, and anti-vaxxers think that it's some gotcha, that COVID vaccines are not vaccines. But they are, in fact, vaccines.
But in any case,
But we should clarify that. Why do you think it is not a vaccine?
Well, it's not a vaccine for a number of different reasons. The primary reason is that it does not create immunity to the pathogen.
We know for a fact that COVID vaccines induce immunity against SARS-CoV-2. We have directly measured the B and T cell mediated immune memory that these vaccines elicit. They are quite robust, durable, and broad. And we know that this immune memory directly results in protection against severe outcomes from the pathogen, i.e. the disease. So yeah, like I said at the beginning of this video, Brett is making bizarre claims that show that he has no idea what he's talking about, and they're so easily debunked, it's laughable.
Okay, but so then is a flu vaccine a vaccine?
It depends. I would like to know more about how well flu vaccines actually work.
Yes, flu vaccines are vaccines. They also elicit immune memory against the influenza strain that they are directed against. Sometimes the influenza strain or strains in the vaccines aren't perfectly matched to the strain that dominantly circulates that year, but despite this, it still provides some good cross-reactive immunity. This is borne out in the epidemiological data. We see very consistently that each year, those who get vaccinated against flu are much less likely to end up in the hospital because of flu or die from it. Again, that's the whole point. Are flu vaccines vaccines? What a stupid question.
So it's not a vaccine by that metric.
It just produces antibodies.
Well, I wouldn't say it just produces antibodies. I would say we don't really know.
Like I said, we do know the answer. Brett just has no idea what he's talking about. He is not an expert in this field. He does not care what the experts say in this field, and he doesn't understand the literature in this field. But you don't need to be an expert to get Joe Rogan to believe you.
The claim that they were safe didn't make a whit of sense. They couldn't possibly know, right? And the reason that they couldn't possibly know is that the word safe, if you say that something is safe, you are not saying that it's harmless. You are saying you know it doesn't carry any risk.
First of all, COVID vaccines were tested for safety in clinical trials, the same process that every drug goes through before it goes on the market. Of course, this process is not perfect, no process is, but there was no evidence at that time to suggest that COVID vaccines were not safe. And after billions of doses given all around the world, and extensive pharmacovigilance surveillance studies, the answer remains the same. They're safe. And this definition of safe is just unrealistic. Nothing in this world is 100% safe. Nothing in this world carries no risk. Is it safe to walk down the street or drive your car to work? Yeah, it generally is. But is it 100% safe? Does it carry no risk? Of course not. No one would say that. It's the same with COVID vaccines or any medication. They are safe, but they don't carry zero risk. The question is, do they carry less risk than what they are preventing? It's a risk-benefit analysis. And that risk-benefit analysis has always remained the same for COVID vaccines. They carry far less risk than COVID itself. And when you do get infected with SARS-CoV-2 after being vaccinated, it greatly reduces your risk of having a severe outcome. But apparently these concepts are just too complicated for anti-vaxxers like Brett.
That people have been vaccinated and then boosted. The more vaccines you get, it seems like there's more prevalence of people catching COVID, which is wild.
Sorry, Joe, that is just not true. If you actually look at the data, you see that you are more likely to be infected with COVID if you are not vaccinated. That's it. There's no complicated explanation needed there. It's just what the data show.
That means, and we can get into this question of the IgG4 result that recently emerged.
What is that?
Oh, good. This IgG4 story. I'm sure Brett will explain the complexities of the immune system and what this observation actually means in the context of COVID, right? No.
IgG4 is actually part of a system in which the body attenuates its own response to an antigen.
Nope.
The evolutionary path we have traveled is causing the pathogen now to be able to trigger a response that will cause the immune system not to fight. Nobody knows what happens next.
Yeah, okay, no, this is just wrong. So let me walk you through what this result actually means. So a group of researchers found that following the third dose of COVID mRNA vaccination, this subset of IgG, which are a class of antibodies, increases. And that subset of antibodies are a kind called IgG4. There's also IgG1 through 3. All of these antibodies have slightly different functions. To help explain the basics, I've got my little antibody plush here. Nice Christmas gift, by the way. Generally, antibodies have this Y structure to them. The tops of the Y here are the parts that actually bind their target, called the antigen. Upon binding that antigen, or that foreign material can no longer perform its function, then we say that that antibody has neutralized that antigen, and we call it a neutralizing antibody. In the case of COVID-19, this is when your antibodies bind the spike protein and neutralize it, meaning that it can't perform its function of letting the virus enter your cells. These IgG4 antibodies are neutralizing. That's a good thing. They stop the virus from being able to enter cells. Another function of antibodies is performed by the bottom of this Y shape. This is called the Fc portion of the antibody. The way it works is once it's bound its target antigen, a cell can actually recognize the Fc portion of the antibody and perform a particular function. For example, if an antibody binds up an antigen and it wants to call in backup, then the Fc portion can interact with an immune cell, and that immune cell, upon interacting with that Fc portion, will start secreting factors to bring more immune cells to the area and ramp up the immune response. However, IgG4 antibodies typically don't have an Fc function. They just neutralize. So why might this be something that would be considered advantageous by an immune system in the context of SARS-CoV-2? Well, how does SARS-CoV-2 actually kill people? Most of the time, it's done by a massive immune response from your body. In other words, the virus replicates really quickly, spreads all over your body, and the immune system has to have an overreaction in order to try to control the infection. We call this a cytokine storm. It's this cytokine storm that can actually cause a lot of damage to your organs and cause you to go into organ failure or respiratory arrest. So what's a way that your body can deal with this? Well, IgG4 seems to be a reasonable answer. Neutralize the antigen, the invaders, without causing an overreaction. That makes sense. And that seems to be what our immune systems are doing. Because when we look at this study and look at the antibodies that our immune system actually produces, IgG4 is not the dominant antibody, it's just an increased percentage of the total classes of antibodies produced. There are still plenty of other antibodies that your immune system produces in response to the vaccines that are capable of performing those cell-mediated functions. But maybe having more IgG4 helps the body to control the infection while not overreacting and causing more damage to your body than is necessary. That's at least what makes theoretical sense with this observation. So for Brett to say we don't know what happens next is silly, because even in the paper itself, they specify that these observations have no implications clinically. In other words, you can't take those results from the paper and apply them to a clinical setting. In order to start investigating that, you have to see what happens to clinical outcomes of people who have 3 or more doses of COVID vaccines. And guess what those results show? Yeah, people with 3 doses or more do better than those who have 2 doses, and much better than those who have 0 doses. Once again, this is an example of Brett making a claim in an area where he has no idea what he's talking about, has 0 expertise, but he doesn't need expertise or to know what he's talking about in order to convince Joe.
When someone gets injected into the deltoid, are there times where it does stay in the deltoid? And is this because of where it's injected in the deltoid? Is it possible that it gets injected and punctures a vein or an artery, and that's how it gets into the entire body, and that's why it only happens in some cases?
No, Joe. In order for what you're worried about to happen, there would have to be major blood vessels in the deltoid big enough to insert a needle into and inject the vaccine directly into the blood. That doesn't exist. Dr. Yan Yu, another science communicator here on YouTube, made a very great video about this that I'll link in the description.
Again, the question of whether or not people are dropping dead at a high rate during athletic events is a readily studyable question, right? It's possible that this happens with some regularity, that we don't know it because it doesn't generally get reported, and that during COVID, people are super sensitive to these things and they're now circulating the clips. It's also possible that it's happening at a much, much higher rate, and that the reason has to do with this very flaw.
Is there data on this?
That's the question. Why isn't there? Why, given how easy a question this is to answer, why isn't there data?
I'm going to give you a rule of thumb. If you have a scientific question about a field you don't know much about, I can almost guarantee you that scientists have already thought about and investigated that question. And that's the case here. Of course there's data. Those who work in the fields of sports medicine and epidemiology track these things all the time. And there is a normal rate of sudden cardiac arrest on sports fields. And there is 0 evidence that COVID vaccines have increased this rate.
Well, one of the things they did was they took the mRNAs, which are spelled, it's a 4-letter code, and they substituted all the uracils, the U's, with a different version of the chemical that renders these things incredibly stable.
Yeah, I've heard this one a lot, but I haven't heard anyone making this claim actually understand what those modifications to that mRNA actually do. RNA is made up of 4 bases, or letters, so to speak, A, U, G, and C. But these 4 letters can have chemical modifications that can slightly change their function. In RNA, the letter U, which is called uracil, can be modified to become something called pseudouracil. This can have a variety of functions depending on the context, but it is a modification that your body makes to RNA all the time. In the context of COVID mRNA vaccines, this modification is added in order to make it more resistant to a part of the immune system called toll-like receptors. You see, if you just inject foreign, regular RNA into your body, your immune system is going to destroy it before it can even do anything. So it's not going to serve as a very good vaccine if that's what happens. So in order to solve this problem, some really smart scientists decided to make the mRNA more resistant to those factors by substituting uracil for pseudouracil. All this does is it makes that mRNA more resistant to those immune factors, those toll-like receptors. It does not make it more stable in the context of regular mRNA decay pathways. Remember, your body is constantly making mRNA. If your body can't make mRNA, you die. But that mRNA is also constantly being turned over. You don't want the mRNA to last forever. It just has to do its job and then decay over time. This is because your body is constantly balancing the expression of all of its genes. So this modification in the mRNA COVID vaccines allows the mRNA to actually last long enough so that it can produce a protein, and that protein can elicit an immune response. But that mRNA is still susceptible to normal pathways of mRNA degradation in your cells. And mRNAs don't usually last very long in your cells. They turn over fairly quickly. And that's the same with mRNA vaccines. As always, I'm linking the studies that I'm showing you in this video in the description, so you can read more about this topic because there's definitely more to it than what I've said here.
So there's the narrative that it saved millions of lives, and you keep hearing that narrative repeated over and over and over again. I don't know how do you think the vaccines have saved lives?
We actually know more about this than you would think. First of all, I should point out that this number, which everyone, including Anthony Fauci, has been repeating in the most recent version of it, was 3 million American lives have been saved by the vaccines, is utter nonsense. It is based on a model.
Roll the real world data.
Those are the bad people. Let's go kill them. We're the good people. We don't kill each other. You punish people for killing each other. You reward them for killing the bad people. This is like tribal. It's gone on forever. You're seeing echoes of that in that woman's tweet.
Okay, we're getting to the end of the video, but I just want to focus on Joe for the remainder of it. This part here was them talking about someone's tweet, which was fake. They go on this whole diatribe about this woman's tweet, and it was fake. The whole tweet was fabricated. She never tweeted it. But not once during their whole conversation did they think to check to make sure that the tweet was real. They just fell for it. They fell for a complete lie. And if that isn't a perfect example of this entire episode, I don't know what is. Anyway, they took that conversation out of the current version of the podcast, so there's at least that. But man, Joe just doesn't learn.
Even logically, it didn't make sense because the vaccine did stop the virus in its tracks. Why would you be angry at people that don't take it? Because they're just going to be vulnerable. Why would you be angry? You should be sad. You should be trying to convince them. Like the only way to convince them that works is with love and understanding.
Joe, there's a reason that people care that others get the vaccine even if they're vaccinated themselves. This was actually summed up in a really good New York Times opinion piece by a medical doctor working in rural Michigan during a particularly bad outbreak of COVID. Essentially, what happens when a lot of people get sick is the hospitals get overwhelmed and other tasks that the hospitals normally do fall by the wayside. If someone needs an emergency operation to get gallstones removed or get an appendix removed, and the hospital can't take care of them at that time, and they die because they can't get the proper care they need in a timely manner, and that's because people weren't getting vaccinated, and it was affecting others. These things actually happened, and it's quite sad that Joe can't see the reality of this, that when more people suffer, it's just bad for everybody. So yeah, that talk about love and understanding coming from Joe is fluffier than my afro. I don't take it seriously, and I don't think it's genuine.
Why were you mad at me when I didn't get seriously ill? Why were people mad at me? Like what? Because I didn't do what they did. And they thought they did the right thing, and I didn't do the right thing, and I'm some crazy kook.
Joe, people were not mad at you for not getting seriously ill. People were mad at you because you have a platform that reaches tens if not hundreds of millions of people, and you're promoting fake cures, things that don't work. That's going to harm people. And that's your responsibility, and you're not taking responsibility for it. That's why people are mad at you. That's your problem. If you chose to not get vaccinated, and instead when you got COVID, you chose to take a medicine cabinet full of stuff, including things that don't work, like ivermectin, and then you say that those things like ivermectin helped you, that's nonsense. That is not evidence-based messaging. In fact, it goes directly against all of this mountains of scientific data showing that ivermectin just doesn't work with COVID. But you didn't seem to care about that. You just seemed to be upset that the media was being mean to you, and you tried to say that you were justified in spreading misinformation. That's not okay. That's not love. That's not understanding. That's you getting offended and doubling down. So yeah, when it comes to COVID, you are a crazy kook. Be better. Sorry. Well, we've reached the end of the video. Another 3-hour-long Joe Rogan podcast debunked. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. As always, all of the links to all of the science that I talk about in this video are linked in the description below so you can read them for yourself. And finally, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so that you can catch me next week, where I'll be debunking some more funky stuff. See you then.